Oh, okay. So, yes. I really wanted to get this Daniel Bryan action figure. And unfortunately I had to get Sin Cara with it. And it's just like the real thing. It never seems to be able to do anything without falling over and hurting itself, much like the real thing. Anyways, I wanted to talk about Daniel Bryan, and we will eventually at some point. But something else came to mind as I was uploading this video, the previous video I did. Check that out, because I was on the thought process of Monster Hills, and then I started to think about Brock Lesnar, and I was just thinking about something in a video. If you haven't seen it, Ariel Helwani, a very well-known interviewer, does a show called the MMA Hour, and I was watching it, and it was an interesting topic because the topic of Brock Lesnar in the UFC Hall of Fame came up, and that is indeed going to be what I want to discuss right now, and I'm going to make it brief because I really would like to hear what people think. And I have observed people's thoughts on Brock Lesnar since he did MMA, and he's now eventually left. He's a very polarizing character to a lot of MMA fans and wrestling fans for a number of reasons. So it's always interesting to talk about him. And one of the main things I've heard from people, and mainly the purists, is that anything that Lesnar does is going to kill the sport. It kills the credibility of the sport. The sport's going to die. Oh, it makes the sport look bad when you have this Brock Lesnar, this pro wrestler, this da-da-da-da, and they go on and on and on. It's almost like those Ring of Honor fans that go on about, oh, don't bring this guy in. He can't work the Ring of Honor style, dude. Anyways, I wonder who that was a shot at. So, I digress. Let's get back to the topic at hand. I was thinking about Brock Lesnar in the UFC Hall of Fame, and people talk about, well, if he goes in the UFC Hall of Fame, the credibility of the Hall of Fame comes into question, and that affects the credibility of the Hall of Fame. Now, I thought about that, and I can see maybe from a sporting standpoint, yes, you would have a point. He's only had, 8 fights, and he was 5-3. And you do have a point there. You do have a point there, and I wouldn't completely disagree with you. But if you want to talk about the credibility of the Hall of Fame, I think that the credibility of it comes into question when there are a ton of people who should be in the UFC Hall of Fame who won't be in because of political reasons. And the political reasons completely surpass the achievements and the contributions that said person has made in a lot of ways. And I think one name in particular would be Frank Shamrock. Frank Shamrock is was the modern prototype of MMA. He had a tremendous career as an MMA fighter. He was one of the few guys that knew how to blend the grappling, the striking and the wrestling with great cardio, and using cardio as a weapon in the sport. He was a tremendous salesman when it came to selling fights. He was one of the guys that kind of showed you where MMA was going to go into the next generation. He was ahead of his time in some respects, and he's a guy that fought when there were very few weight classes, fought guys that probably outweighed him by God knows how much, and he went out and beat them, and he beat them pretty handedly. I mean, look at the fight with Tito Ortiz. It's one of the greatest fights of all time in UFC history. If you haven't seen it, it's UFC 22. It's one of the fights that I always remember. It's a tremendous fight. But the fact is, this is someone that should be in the Hall of Fame, and just as much as Bruno Sammartino should be in the Hall of Fame for the WWE, and he's not, and it's for political reasons, and in my opinion that hurts the credibility of the Hall of Fame. So the credibility of the Hall of Fame, you could already say, is sorry, I've eaten too much, comes into question. Now, the other thing I want to say is, should Brock be in the UFC Hall of Fame? The argument I can make for it is this, and all the purists, all the historians, they can't deny this. They cannot deny this. When the MMA landscape, and you look back at the MMA landscape many years ago, and I'm talking about when there was a Pride and a UFC. Pride was the bigger promotion until about 2005, 2006. Things started to change. But when there was a pride in the UFC, when it came to the top heavyweight title in all of MMA at that time, and you all know it, the top title at that time for heavyweights was the Pride Heavyweight Championship. The UFC Heavyweight Championship was not viewed in the same way. It took a long time to re-establish that division. The division of the UFC was light heavyweight, and that was the division people wanted to see and cared about because of Chuck Liddell, Couture, Belfort, Ortiz, Babalu Sobral, and the list goes on. That was the weight class that was their baby. The UFC heavyweight title was not viewed in the same way, and in fact I would even dare say that at that time the UFC heavyweight title, when there was a Pride, was basically viewed as, I'll give you a modern day equivalent, the Bellator heavyweight title, or even the Strikeforce title 2 years ago when there was a Strikeforce in the UFC in two separate organisations. That's what it was. And then it took a lot of rebuilding for the UFC heavyweight. It took a lot of rebuilding for that weight class, for that belt, to establish some kind of credibility and popularity. And I feel that there were many reasons for that, but one of the main contributions to that was indeed the intrigue of Brock Lesnar, this pro wrestler, this monstrous looking man going over into MMA fighting their heavyweights. And I felt that Brock Lesnar was one of the main reasons why heavyweight fighting in the UFC developed and became popular again, and people started becoming intrigued. And if you look at the numbers, he pulled in some pretty big numbers for that weight class and gained that weight class a lot of momentum, because the first fight a lot of people bought, and yeah, he lost to Frank Mir in 60 seconds. Then the second fight did quite well. He's always done very good numbers, and the fact is people became interested about the heavyweights again. And then in addition, you can say the Nogueiras, the return of Randy Couture, and a lot of these guys that started to come up started to help it. But it needed that initial shot in the arm, and that, in my opinion, came from Brock Lesnar coming up there, to the point where if you had told me in 2005 that the UFC heavyweight title was going to be the headliner for a pay-per-view and it was going to have over 1 million people pay for it, I would have laughed at you and said there's no way Arlovski and Sylvia were going to do that. And you know, look what happened. I think that based on that, and based on the importance that the popularity and the importance that the belt started to gain around the time he came back, that should be taken into account. And perhaps, maybe, just maybe, that's part of a reason for why Lesnar should be in there. And also, think about it, I don't think he ever did anything to really damage the sport. If you want to talk about damaging the sport of MMA, you have to think about something that would almost kill the sport dead. Lesnar never did anything that killed the sport dead. In fact, a lot of people, wrestling fans in particular, crossed over and started watching MMA, and now they're watching the John Joneses and the Rashad Evans and the Rory McDonalds and the Shane Mills and the George St. Pierres of the world. So that's just something I wanted to say. Let me know what you think. I'm sure there's some great arguments against it and for it, and that's what we do here on YouTube. So right away, and yeah, have a good one. Take care, everybody.